There is a moment that almost every intelligent person experiences, and once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. You are in a conversation with someone who is completely wrong, yet somehow they are the most confident person in the room. They speak with certainty. They defend their opinion aggressively, and no matter how clearly you explain the facts, no matter how carefully you present logic, nothing changes. The more you try to explain, the more stubborn they become. If you have ever walked away from a conversation like that, feeling mentally drained, frustrated, and strangely defeated, even though you knew you were right, then pay very close attention to what you are about to hear. Because the biggest mistake intelligent people make is believing that intelligence wins arguments. It doesn't. In fact, your intelligence might be the exact thing that makes you lose. Before we go deeper, take 2 seconds and subscribe if you enjoy psychology and philosophy content like this. Most people who watch these videos never subscribe, but the ones who do usually end up seeing the world very differently. Now here is the uncomfortable truth. Most people do not argue to discover the truth. They argue to protect their ego. That single fact explains almost every exhausting debate you have ever had. You think the conversation is about ideas. They think the conversation is about status. You bring logic, they bring pride. And pride will always fight harder than logic. Arthur Schopenhauer understood this better than most philosophers. He studied arguments not to find truth, but to understand why people refuse to accept it. In his work on argument strategies, he described something brutally simple about human nature. People care far more about being right than about actually discovering what is right. Once you understand this, a strange realization appears. The person you are arguing with is not actually listening to you. They are waiting for their turn to speak. Think about the last time you tried to explain something complex to someone who was completely convinced of their own opinion. You carefully laid out your reasoning. You brought evidence. You simplified the explanation so it would be easier to understand. And then something strange happened. They ignored all of it. They repeated the same flawed argument they started with. It feels insane when it happens. Your brain immediately tries to solve the puzzle. Maybe you explained it poorly. Maybe you should use a better example. Maybe you should break the concept down even further. So you try again and again and again, until eventually you realize something disturbing. You're the only person in the conversation who is actually thinking. Psychologists later gave a name to one of the mechanisms behind this phenomenon: the Dunning-Kruger effect. It describes a cognitive bias where people with very low ability in a subject tend to dramatically overestimate their competence. But the real danger is not just that they are wrong. The real danger is that they are completely convinced they are right. Confidence without competence creates a psychological armor that logic simply cannot penetrate. When you present evidence that contradicts their belief, their brain does not interpret it as useful information. It interprets it as an attack. And when the human ego feels attacked, it stops thinking. Instead, it defends. This is where intelligent people fall into what researchers sometimes call the intelligence trap. Because the smarter you are, the more likely you are to assume that other people process information the same way you do. You assume they evaluate evidence. You assume they change their mind when presented with better arguments. You assume they value accuracy, but many people do not operate that way at all. Daniel Kahneman explained this with the concept of two mental systems. One system is slow, analytical, and logical. The other is fast, emotional, and instinctive. Highly reflective thinkers spend a lot of time using the slow system, but many people rarely leave the fast one. They feel something, immediately turn that feeling into an opinion, and then defend that opinion as if it were a proven fact. When you enter a debate with them using logic and careful reasoning, you are essentially speaking a different language. It is like explaining calculus to someone who insists that numbers are a conspiracy. And while you're working hard to explain your perspective, they are using almost no mental energy at all. They simply refuse to change their mind. That is why arguing with fools feels so exhausting. You are sprinting, they are standing still, and the longer the conversation continues, the more energy you lose while they remain completely unaffected. Schopenhauer noticed this pattern centuries ago. He realized that in debates with irrational people, truth has almost no value. Facts do not matter. Evidence does not matter. What matters is psychological momentum. And once you sense of identity from being right, it feels satisfying when someone finally admits you were correct. It feels like intellectual justice. But seeking validation from a foolish mind is one of the fastest ways to drain your energy. Schopenhauer would likely ask a very uncomfortable question. Why do you need a fool to acknowledge your intelligence? Why does their agreement matter? Imagine spending hours explaining a complex painting to someone who cannot see colors. Even if you describe every detail perfectly, the experience will never reach them. At some point, you would stop explaining, not because the painting lost its value, but because the listener lacks the ability to perceive it. The same principle applies to many arguments. When you release the need to prove yourself, something surprising happens. The emotional pressure disappears. You no longer feel the urge to defend every correct idea. You no longer feel personally attacked by every incorrect opinion. Instead, you start noticing something far more important. The real cost of arguing with fools is not that they are wrong. The real cost is that they slowly consume your mental energy. And that energy is far too valuable to waste. But there is an even darker aspect of this problem that most people never consider. Stupidity does not just exhaust you. It spreads. And if you are not careful, spending too much time navigating irrational thinking can begin to distort your own. Most people think stupidity is simply the absence of intelligence, something passive, something harmless. But that assumption is dangerously naive. Stupidity is not passive, it is aggressive, and more importantly, it's contagious. If you spend enough time around chaotic thinking, irrational reactions, and endless emotional arguments, something subtle begins to happen inside your own mind. At first, you barely notice it. You simply feel tired after certain conversations. Your patience becomes thinner. Your focus weakens. But over time, the effect becomes clearer. Your mental clarity starts to erode. This is not just a philosophical idea. Cognitive load theory explains why this happens. Your brain has a limited amount of processing capacity. Every decision, every emotional reaction, every attempt to interpret someone else's irrational behavior consumes part of that capacity. When you interact with a deeply irrational person, your mind works overtime, trying to make sense of something that fundamentally makes no sense. You predict their reactions. You prepare responses. You suppress your frustration. You search for ways to explain ideas more clearly. All of this burns mental energy. Meanwhile, the other person spends almost none. They repeat the same opinion. They defend it emotionally. They refuse to update their thinking. The conversation moves in circles while your brain is doing all the work. This imbalance slowly drains you. And if the environment is constant, a workplace, a family dynamic, a social circle, the effect compounds. Your mind becomes overloaded by the continuous effort of navigating irrationality. You become irritable. You lose creative focus. You start making decisions more impulsively than you normally would. It is as if someone has quietly installed background software in your brain that constantly consumes processing power. Schopenhauer understood this long before modern psychology described it scientifically. That is one reason he valued solitude so intensely. Many people interpreted his distance from society as hatred for humanity. But if you read his reflections carefully, it becomes clear that he was not avoiding people out of bitterness. He was protecting his mind. He believed that a person's intellectual environment shapes their thinking far more than they realize. Spend enough time surrounded by shallow conversations, petty conflicts, and stubborn ignorance, and your mind slowly adapts to that level. It becomes normal. To explain this tension, Schopenhauer described something known as the porcupine dilemma. Imagine a group of porcupines during a freezing winter night. To survive the cold, they move closer together for warmth. But the closer they get, the more their sharp quills prick one another. Eventually, the pain forces them apart again. They are trapped between two uncomfortable choices: freeze in isolation or bleed in proximity. Human relationships often follow the same pattern. Total isolation is painful, but too much closeness with the wrong people can be equally damaging. The intelligent person eventually learns that the solution is not complete withdrawal, but distance with boundaries. You cannot avoid foolish people entirely. They appear everywhere, in offices, in social groups, sometimes even within your own family. But you can control how much of your mind they are allowed to access. One of the most effective strategies is something that feels almost theatrical. You create an avatar. This avatar is the version of you that interacts with people who drain your energy. The avatar is polite, calm, agreeable. It does not reveal your deeper thoughts. It does not engage in long explanations. It simply nods, acknowledges, and moves on. When someone presents a questionable opinion, the avatar responds with short, neutral phrases. "That's an interesting perspective. I see what you mean." That's one way to look at it. Notice what these responses accomplish. They do not confirm the idea, but they also do not challenge it. They remove friction. And when friction disappears, most foolish arguments simply fade away. The person feels heard, their ego remains intact, and the conversation moves forward without draining your mental reserves. Meanwhile, your real mind remains protected behind a layer of detachment. This approach might feel slightly manipulative at first. Many people feel guilty about it. Society trains us to believe that honesty requires constant confrontation of incorrect ideas. But constant confrontation is not wisdom. Sometimes it is simply self-destruction. Not every idea deserves your intellectual energy. Not every debate deserves your time. In fact, one of the most dangerous habits intelligent people develop is the belief that they are responsible for correcting everyone around them. This belief sounds noble, but in practice it often becomes a trap. You start trying to educate people who have no desire to learn. You invest hours explaining concepts that are immediately rejected. You slowly become the unpaid teacher in conversations where no student exists. Meanwhile, your own goals, your projects, your growth, your creativity receive less and less attention. Your energy is quietly redirected toward arguments that change nothing. And this leads to an uncomfortable realization. Every minute you spend trying to fix the thinking of a stubborn fool is a minute stolen from building something meaningful in your own life. But there is an even more dangerous situation that many intelligent people eventually face. It is one thing to deal with foolish people in casual conversations. It is something entirely different when the fool holds power over you. Because when incompetence gains authority, logic alone becomes completely useless, and surviving that situation requires a much more subtle strategy. Everything becomes more complicated when the foolish person is not just someone you casually interact with, but someone who has authority over your life. A manager, a supervisor, a powerful colleague, someone whose decisions affect your career, your income, or your reputation. In those situations, the normal instinct of an intelligent person can become extremely dangerous. Because intelligence, when displayed too openly in front of an insecure mind, often triggers hostility instead of respect. Think about it from a psychological perspective. A person who has reached a position of power while secretly sensing their own intellectual limitations lives with a constant internal tension. On some level, they know they are not the sharpest mind in the room, but power protects them from confronting that reality. When someone noticeably more capable enters their environment, the situation becomes threatening. Your competence becomes a mirror reflecting their inadequacy, and the human ego hates mirrors that expose weakness. Schopenhauer described this dynamic with brutal clarity. He argued that displaying obvious superiority in the presence of mediocrity often provokes resentment rather than admiration. The mediocre mind does not celebrate excellence. It experiences it as humiliation, so the attack rarely comes directly. Instead of criticizing your intelligence, the insecure authority figure targets your personality. Suddenly you are described as difficult, arrogant, or not a team player. Your ideas are ignored. Your contributions are minimized. Your progress slows for reasons that are never openly explained. From the outside, it looks confusing. From the inside, it feels deeply unfair. But psychologically, it follows a very predictable pattern. You walked into the domain of a fragile ego while holding a mirror. And the easiest way to remove that mirror is to remove you. History provides countless examples of this dynamic. One of the most fascinating appears in the story of Sima Yi during the era of the Three Kingdoms in ancient China. Sima Yi was widely considered one of the most brilliant strategists of his time. His mind was sharp, calculating, and capable of seeing long-term outcomes that others completely missed. But his superior intelligence created a problem. He served under a powerful regent named Qiao Shuang, a man who possessed authority but lacked the strategic brilliance of his subordinate. Qiao Shuang sensed the difference between them, and that difference created fear. If Sima Yi openly demonstrated his brilliance, he would be perceived as a threat. And in that political environment, threats were eliminated quickly. Sima Yi understood something that many intelligent people struggled to accept. Raw intelligence is not always the winning move. Sometimes survival requires concealment. So instead of competing with Chao Shuang for intellectual dominance, Sima Yi did something that seemed almost humiliating. He pretended to become weak. He withdrew from public life. When spies visited his home to observe him, they found a frail old man who could barely function. He spoke slowly. He acted confused. At one point, he even let food spill down his clothing, as if he were too feeble to feed himself properly. The report returned to Chao Shuang was exactly what Sima Yi wanted. The once brilliant strategist had become harmless, a broken old man. Chao Shuang relaxed. His guard dropped. The perceived threat disappeared. And months later, when the moment was perfect, Sima Yi revealed the truth. He rose from his supposed weakness, mobilized loyal forces, and executed a swift political coup that seized control of the entire government. Chao Shuang never saw it coming. The strategy worked because Sima Yi understood a psychological principle that many people ignore. Your intelligence is not a trophy to display. It is a weapon to deploy carefully. When you are dealing with a powerful fool, openly proving your superiority rarely produces the result you want. It activates their insecurity and pushes them into defensive aggression. A much more effective tactic is subtle ego management. You allow them to feel superior. You ask for small pieces of advice. You let them correct minor details. You occasionally praise their ideas. To an outside observer, this may look like submission, but it is actually strategic camouflage. You are not surrendering your intelligence. You are temporarily hiding it so that you can operate freely without triggering unnecessary resistance. Meanwhile, the person in power relaxes. Their ego feels satisfied. They stop viewing you as a competitor. And once their guard lowers, your real capabilities can be used where they matter most. Quietly building influence, developing projects, and positioning yourself for the right moment. This approach requires emotional discipline. Your pride will occasionally protest. Part of you will want to correct every bad idea and prove your competence openly. But remember the larger objective. Winning arguments is not the same as winning outcomes. Sometimes the quietest strategist in the room is the one who ultimately controls the entire board. And once you truly understand this shift from intellectual pride to strategic patience, a much deeper realization begins to emerge. Many of the exhausting conflicts in your life were never about truth in the first place. They were about ego. Once you start seeing the world through this lens, a strange shift happens inside your mind. The conversations that used to exhaust you begin to look different. The arguments that once triggered your frustration now feel predictable, almost mechanical. Instead of feeling pulled into every disagreement, you begin to notice the invisible patterns running beneath them. You start seeing ego where you once saw conviction. You start seeing insecurity where you once saw aggression. And most importantly, you start seeing how much of your own energy you were giving away. For years, you may have believed that your role in the world was to clarify confusion, correct misinformation, and guide people toward better thinking. It felt responsible. It felt like the duty of an intelligent mind. But reality is far more uncomfortable than that. Most people do not want clarity. They want comfort. They want their existing beliefs protected. They want their identity affirmed. They want the emotional stability that comes from feeling correct. Truth is often disruptive. It forces people to reconsider the stories they tell themselves about who they are and how the world works. And many individuals would rather defend a comforting illusion than face that disruption. Once you understand this, the endless debates you used to engage in start to look like theater. Two people standing on a stage, presenting arguments, raising their voices, repeating points again and again. The audience chooses sides based on emotion long before the debate even begins. And when the performance ends, nothing changes. The opponent does not suddenly adopt a new worldview. The audience does not suddenly reconsider their biases. Everyone simply returns to the position they already held. The entire exchange was never about discovery. It was about spectacle. But the most effective minds in history rarely play that game. They do not argue for applause. They operate quietly for outcomes. Think about architects building a massive structure in the middle of a crowded city. They do not ask every passerby for approval. They do not stop construction every time someone questions their design. They focus on the blueprint. They focus on the structure they are creating. And while everyone else is busy debating what should be built, the architect is already pouring the concrete. This is the mindset that separates intelligence from power. Intelligence enjoys proving itself correct. Power focuses only on achieving the objective. That shift changes everything. Instead of wasting hours defending your ideas to people who cannot appreciate them, you invest that time building something real. Instead of exhausting yourself trying to win arguments that lead nowhere, you quietly move forward while others remain trapped in endless debates. And eventually something surprising happens. The same people who once dismissed your ideas begin noticing the results. Not because you convinced them, but because reality eventually speaks louder than arguments ever could. Your projects grow, your decisions compound, your environment changes. Meanwhile, the individuals who spent years arguing remain exactly where they started, still talking, still defending the same opinions, still trapped inside the same mental loops. This is why Schopenhauer believed that emotional detachment from foolish conflict was not cruelty. It was clarity. Your attention is one of the most valuable resources you possess. Every hour you spend engaging with someone who is committed to misunderstanding you is an hour stolen from your own development. And once you truly understand that cost, something inside you relaxes. You stop reacting to every provocation. You stop explaining yourself to people who are determined not to understand. You observe. You analyze. You choose your battles with precision. When someone insults you out of ignorance, you recognize it for what it is. Not an accurate judgment, but a misdiagnosis. When someone rejects an idea that is beyond their current understanding, you no longer interpret it as failure. You simply move forward, because the goal was never to be validated by everyone around you. The goal was to build something meaningful with the intelligence you already have. Now here is something I want you to think about. Look back at the arguments that drained you the most in the past few years. The endless debates, the people who refused to listen, the conversations that left you frustrated and mentally exhausted. What would have happened if you had simply walked away from those battles? How much energy would you have saved? How much progress could you have made instead? Drop a comment and tell me the one type of argument you refuse to waste energy on anymore. I read the comments, and your perspective might help someone else recognize the same pattern in their own life. And if you know someone who constantly finds themselves stuck in pointless debates with stubborn people, share this video with them. It might be the insight that finally frees them from that cycle. Because once you truly understand this principle, you realize something powerful. Your intelligence was never meant to be used proving fools wrong. It was meant to build a life where their opinions no longer matter.